Welcome back to Spare No Arrows. I'm here with a very special guest today, Mike Leonberger, and he is the creator of Spirit of Fear clothing. You can rep your brand there. Spirit of Fear clothing. He makes a lot of cool clothing, and you can go follow him on Instagram at Spirit of Fear clothing. He's got a website, and the main reason why I brought him on the show today is because Mike is a premillennial, and I am a postmillennial. I have talked a lot about eschatology over the past few episodes, and Mike and I have carried on conversations on Instagram behind the scenes. And I thought, like, man, it would be so cool just to have a live discussion, since I don't get very much reasonable pushback in the comment section. And so I know you're a reasonable guy, and we could be able to participate in a reasonable discussion about premillennial versus postmillennial eschatology. So, hey, welcome on the show, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I look forward to this. I've been listening to everything that you've put out and agree or disagree. I'm actually, another point of disagreement that we have is I'm not reformed. So we can go
That's
into
okay.
that too. But I'm open to all of it. I'm very humble to realize, or no, shouldn't, I'm not going to brag like that, but I humbly understand that these are debates that have been going on for millennia, and there's faithful Christians on both sides, and I look to understand how both sides of it come to understand what they do. So I'm open to a lot of it, and
Yeah.
just this is where I find myself lining up as kind of a free will type person with the, but trying to understand that dichotomy between free will and what God is predetermined, as well as premillennial. But I
Yeah.
see the postmillennial view. I like it too.
Well, that's good. Yeah, I see a lot of people really staunchly entrenched in their stance, and they think everybody else aside from them is a heretic, because just because something makes sense to them and another view doesn't make sense to them, uh, they must be stupid, or they must be heretical, or they're probably not even Christians. And so, yeah, that's
Mm,
the wrong way to be. And so, no matter what position you hold, as long as it's within Christian orthodoxy, and premillennialism is, and postmillennialism is, and amillennialism is, then we should
correct.
all just be willing to get along. And at the church that I go to, this is there's a wonderful example of this, where we have premillennials and amillennials and postmillennials, and we have reformed and non-reformed, and we have we might have non-reformed, but we have credo Baptist and Pado Baptist. Like, we have all over the place, and the important thing is unity, and being able to have these disagreements without, on secondary issues, without dividing. And this definitely is a secondary issue, although I think it is really important, and it does impact
Yeah,
how we behave, and the things we do on earth towards a certain goal, because how the
sure.
world is going to end up. Eschatology, for people who don't know, is the idea of how the world is going to end up, where the world's going. And premillennialism and postmillennialism look very different. And so I think, and
That's
you
correct.
probably also think, that very much impacts how we uh, how we behave on Earth now. Premillennialism is, and then you can correct me or add stuff if you disagree at all. But premillennialism, the millennium is referred to as the millennial reign of Christ. This, like, perfect situation where Christ reigns, and Christ is ruling, and the world is a pretty good place, if not perfect. And premillennialism believes that Jesus returns pre that reign. So Jesus returns, he wipes out all the evil, and then he reigns. Postmillennialism says that Jesus's reign is actually right now, and Jesus is reigning, and this millennial kingdom is the kingdom of God that was instituted, when Jesus ascended, and
Yeah,
that is lasting now until Jesus's enemies will be made his footstool. Then Jesus returns post the millennium.
correct. Yeah,
Is that
yeah.
cool? So you agree with that? So why are you a premillennial?
Well, I mean, as you've talked about before, my predominant upbringing is in the pre-mill worldview, right? Churches that I've gone to, my parents are big into it. My mom, especially, uh, is just awaiting the day of his return. which I mean, heck, we all are, right? I
And
mean,
so am
that's
I.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Um, but what I see so much of is that futurist prophecy, and how much of it is kind of coming true. And I'm not talking the sensational type stuff that people are like, oh, this happened over here, so that must be it. But just the general trend of things. And again, I can understand your argument because I've heard too talking about, you know, the scope of the world is getting better. Uh, so I do see that, but I also see, I feel like it's two directions. I feel like in one side you've got the general, I say, world is getting better, as far as more people are coming to know Christ and more people are turning. Uh, but on the other side, you've got the, for lack of a better term, we'll call them the elite status, the kind of ruling class, these people that think that they're over pretty much everyone because of either power or influence or money. Um, the tools that they've been are given are more and more towards what it seems like is described to me, at least in having, like I said, a futurist viewpoint of Revelation. There seems like a lot of that is becoming available that was never in place before. This
Mm.
kind of coming together of like what they call the one world government was never really an option in the past, and it's still tenuous because you've got China's never really going to participate in something like that. But also, they, you know, if you believe the premillennial viewpoint, there's, you know, China doesn't really, there is warring between this one world government as well, right?
Mm.
But I mean, like I said, the control pieces of it with social media, with one the central currencies, with all these pieces that there are, and then you have like the Neuralink portion coming up. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah. So what it sounds like you're kind of saying is that Revelation points to a lot of what seems to be one world government type stuff. I don't know if I would agree with that. And if you have any
Sure.
specifics, we can talk about the specifics. So
Yeah.
in premillennialism, it basically believes that the world is getting worse and worse, and all of this destruction and a lot of the prophecies, this futurist interpretation of these prophecies says that all of these things are yet to come. But my position, I think that a lot of the prophecies in Revelation are still yet to come. Like the new heavens and new earth are not here yet, of
Yeah.
course, but a lot of the ideas of, like, for example, the destruction that Jesus refers to in Matthew 24, which I think is one of the key verses for me that changed my mind over to postmillennialism just over the past few years. I think that has already happened. And
Mhm.
so I think that's one of the biggest differences between our views. And so one of the most convincing things for you for premillennialism is the fact that the world seems to be more like more evil seems to be empowered in the world than it used to be. So like I would say the world is getting better and better, but then you would agree with that, but you would also say it's getting worse and worse. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So I hold both viewpoints at the same time.
No, no, no. Like good is getting more good, but the bad is also getting more bad. Is that what I don't want to mischaracterize what you're saying.
No, fair enough. I would agree. Yeah, I would say that the bad has more tools at their disposal, like I said, than ever in history
Yeah, sure.
to get to where they ultimately would like to be. I mean, you wouldn't disagree. I would think that there are people out there who would love to have full control over our lives,
Oh
some
yeah,
sort
for
of
sure.
aristocracy of the powerful.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, why wouldn't it? It's always been a part of history. I mean, you have kings and queens, and they always thought they were better than the people.
Yeah.
We don't necessarily have that now, but we kind of do. It's like a hidden aristocracy. We don't know who they are. They're not sitting on a throne somewhere that we have to worship them yet.
Yeah. Well, kind of in some places, or they literally worship their rulers. And even in America, like in a way, a lot of people worship, if not the president, they worship the idea of the government. Like a lot of people
Yeah.
who were closing their churches and
God.
kept them closed for way too long. definitely showed that their God was not the God of the Bible, but it was the God of the government. And so, yeah, that's totally happening. But how is that any different than people who, obviously you and I would both agree that there are people who are power hungry, control freaks that have existed since the beginning of time, tyrants.
Mhm.
So how are things actually moving closer to that direction for us? Is it because of our technology?
I would think so. That's where I would put it for sure. It's the ability for collusion between them
Hmm.
that was never really in place before. I mean, you couldn't have the King of England necessarily teaming up with someone in Africa. They would conquer, and expand their own influence, but this kind of global peace that was never really available in the past because we didn't have air travel, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have all these technological advances that are coming up and enabling this collusion of forces.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because I see technology and, just from looking at the world, and I, like you agreed actually, that we're better off today than we ever have been in the
For
past,
sure, 100%.
which a lot of premillennials would not admit that. They would say, like, no, that doesn't fit into my theology. Like, we have to be worse off now because
Right.
like the world has to be getting worse. And that's just what the Bible says, even though I would disagree with that. But, and it sounds like you disagree with that. But, when I see technology, yeah, like every new piece of technology or every new tool that we create has the ability to do evil, but it also has the ability to do
Yes.
good. And so with
Yes.
every piece of technology that comes out, yeah, we can, you can use like the internet to take away people's privacy and do surveillance and control people, but you can also use the internet to, like, you know, send the Bible to millions and millions and millions of people and
Hmm.
translate it automatically and, evangelize and share more Christian content than people ever could before in history, and so
Yeah.
on. And so I see technology as like, yeah, it can do evil, but it can also do good. And the net is that the world is becoming a better place through technology and not worse. So we both
And that,
recognize that the world is both getting better and worse in different ways. But maybe the one of the biggest differences between our views is that I think the good is going to overcome in the end, and you think that evil is going to overcome in the end. I mean,
well,
barring
not exactly.
barring
I
the
still think,
second coming, because
yeah.
Jesus is going to come back and he's going to make everything good, right? But I mean, right before that, does because what a lot of premillennials say, yeah, like, you're familiar with John MacArthur. John MacArthur's famous for saying, like, we lose here. That's what I'm talking about. I want to say that we win here. And then a lot of premillennials, they don't like what John MacArthur said because they're like, no. Because I mean, if you're a Christian, you win anyway. But like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying on earth, God's plan for humanity prior to his second coming, is it for the church to overcome evil? Is it for the church to fill the earth, or is it for the church to be defeated by evil so that God can swoop in um and fix everything himself?
Yeah.
So are you comfortable saying we lose here?
Yeah, I don't know if I've thought of it that way or put it that way. Though the way you laid it out, I can see how you could put it in those terms.
Yeah. John MacArthur does, at least, and you might not, but it does
Yeah.
seem physically we lose. And to me, I mean, to me, it seems impossible to get out of. But if you can get out of it, I would like to see it. But I'm just curious.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, the framing of win or lose might be a little too black and white
Hmm.
for what I would think of it. But if you're going to put it in those terms, I guess I would probably lean towards the losing side of things.
Yeah.
But
And that's good. I think that's being honest like that. I
yeah.
appreciate that. And like, that's the thing that I contended with, like, something inside of me makes that not feel right. Like,
Mm,
it doesn't feel right saying the church loses, even though even though God, comes in and rescues them at the end. Like, it doesn't feel right saying that. So I think I understand the tension.
I'd have to put more thought through that idea, though. Like I said, I
Yeah.
mean, I respect John MacArthur, and I think, I don't agree with obviously everything that he thinks, and I wouldn't agree with anyone entirely on anything, which I don't think we should. But to say again that the church loses is tough for me to put it in that way. Just not
Right.
because I don't agree with it, but yeah, I don't know how I would characterize it. Like I said, if you wanted a black and white term, then yeah, I guess we got to say the church loses. But I think the church is doing everything, and it can even be growing and expanding as I believe it actually is right now. I think that, like I said, there's a lot of with over the last, what are we talking, 5 to 10 years, especially in North America. I'm not necessarily speaking to worldwide, although I know that there is movement there too. You're seeing a lot of people waking up to just the garbage that we've been dealing with,
Yeah.
whether you call it woke culture or all these other things. And there's a big pushback against that, which again, I think those people that are on that side are trying to hide, since they control most of our media and whatnot. They're trying to hide that pushback that they're getting.
Yeah.
But I do see people turning, but I don't know that necessarily. I don't know that necessarily, like I said, I think the church continues, it grows, and it's building, and then Christ, yeah, then that return comes anyways.
Yeah.
Because I've
Yeah.
heard, that tribulation that we talk about, the 7-year tribulation that people, and I'm a pre-trib. If I'm anything, I'm pre-trib, premillennial for
Mm.
sure, because there's too many instances of the people being rescued. The archetype of Noah and Joseph and his family, and all these sort of things of people being rescued before trials, the faithful being rescued before trials.
Yeah. Explain that. What do you mean by pre-trib, premillennial?
Sure, of course. Well, I mean, yeah, give an explanation for people is, so there's a 7-year tribulation, a very difficult time. I would believe that the tribulation period is for the Jewish believers to turn them back. It's that time of difficulty, and they will, ultimately benefit with a return to Christ, or coming to know Christ. And it's, what is it, 7 years, 3.5 good years where things on earth seem decent, and then 3.5 years of much worse times.
Something
And
like that. Yeah.
yeah. And so the pre-tribulation, which talks about a rapture happening prior to those 7 years of Christ's church. And there are other beliefs of a post or a mid-trib rapture where, 3.5 years in, people get plucked out, and then the post-trib rapture, which doesn't make much sense to me at all.
Yeah, and I don't believe in the rapture. Well, I mean, it depends on how you want to define rapture, but like rapture as in a taking up of God's people, I think that happens during the resurrection. And so there will be a kind of rapture, but often when people think of rapture is like the Left Behind series, people's are just going to vanish and their clothes are going to flop down on the ground, which, I mean, is that what you think is something like that is going to happen?
Yeah, well, I don't know the technical.
You don't know exactly what it looks like, of course, but just like people will somehow in some event just vanish off the earth, and then the unfaithful will remain for. Okay, interesting.
Yeah, I do lean that way. Again, I don't hold any of this. It's not core to what I'm believing, but that is the way that I would lean. Yes.
Yeah, interesting. So another question I wanted to ask is, so that was one of the things that was difficult for me, which led to my conversion to postmillennialism. The idea that like the church loses here, I was like, something doesn't feel right about that. I think, if God establishes this thing, it ought to not be destroyed if it's like his fundamental plan for working out his salvation in the world, which is the church. But the other thing that I really struggled with that ended up taking me into postmillennialism was the idea that Jesus. So I believe that Jesus is king now. He is ruling in heaven now. He's not king later. He's not king once he once the second coming happens, he's king now. So where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I haven't done a ton of looking into kind of consistent theology or eschatology theology with this piece. I agree with you.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
no, I do. I mean, I says it clearly, like he's taken the seat. So I do agree with you in that.
Yeah.
Um, how that
Interesting.
plays out on Earth is not. I don't quite, like I said, I haven't done enough diving into that piece of it
Yeah.
to explain, like I said, the idea that yes, he's the king, and yes, bad stuff's happening. You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I
Yeah.
do think that the Satan, I do think that Satan is not bound, right,
Okay.
until the millennium, um, and that he does have somewhat, I don't know, he has a leash, but he has like a lot of control over what goes on.
Yeah, I would actually agree with you. So, in my view, that Satan is bound during the millennium, like the Bible says, and if we are
Okay.
currently in the millennial reign of Christ, and Christ is actually reigning, we have to ask, like, as a premillennial, you're going to have to be like, well, I mean, Christ. That's why a lot of premillennials deny the idea that Christ is king now, because
Mm,
they know if Christ is king, then that must mean that, like, Satan is bound and that his kingdom, things are going to be getting better, and they just have to believe that things are getting worse, and so therefore they throw out all the other stuff too.
yeah.
And so, like, we agree on this, actually, so this is awesome. But what I would say, I would actually agree with you on the idea about Satan, where because this is the millennium, and I do believe that Satan is bound, but there is still, like, Satan no longer has total rule over the earth. He's bound. He's not destroyed, but he's bound. So, like, like you
Okay.
said, he's on a leash. Like, I would, that's to me a perfect description. Like, he is bound in a leash. He's
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 not bound physically, can't move, but he's bound within boundaries.
yeah, he's not bound to where he can do nothing or exert no
Mm,
influence, because
right.
obviously Satan still has influence in the world. And so, and postmillennialists believe that, but Satan is limited in his power.
It's interesting, yeah, because I know in like the post-millennial idea, or sorry, the premillennial idea, you're looking at an actual binding and removing
Yeah.
from the earth kind of thing. That Christ comes, like, yeah, he reigns currently from heaven, but he will reign on earth for the millennium, is as a premillennial viewpoint. And
Yeah.
during that time, Satan will be bound completely. Like he won't have the ability to influence, is in my understanding of it. But what happens is that it allows, what ends up happening is it just shows the depravity of man still, that we still rebel without the influence of the devil being involved. And then by the end of that premillennial, 1,000 years, you have that full out rebellion against Christ's rule of our own volition,
Mm.
without without outside external forces, pushing that.
I wanted to also dive into some Bible verses and to talk about maybe some of the specific prophecies, or the different ways that we interpret them.
Like I understand the idea that a lot of the prophecies had been fulfilled, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think most premillennial will agree that the prophecies that you talked about, or that you talk about, like the temple and all that sort of stuff, um, or the fall of, a lot of that happened in 70 AD. It's just that the futurists will say that it has a double meaning, right? Like a lot of
Ah,
this,
okay.
it'll have the one fulfillment and then a secondary fulfillment as well.
Interesting. And is that where you are?
I would think so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see a lot. Well, so one I wanted to go to specifically, Matthew 24, which is where Jesus is describing the destruction of the temple and then the end of the age.
Mhm.
Because that, I'm curious if you would say there's two different um, fulfillments of this prophecy, or if you would just say this happens in the future. Because I think most premillennials that I've seen want to say that this only happened in the future and none of this has happened At least this particular prophecy has happened in the past. Another key verse that I want to get your opinion on, what he says is, and I can look it up while you're responding if you'd like me to, but he says all of these things will come to pass before this generation passes away.
Yeah, and so I am influenced by more the Calvary Chapel teaching. And
Okay.
so that's what I'm finding out. Like I'm currently attending a Calvary Chapel. So I feel like they're a little bit out of step with more of the older historical churches, like and their premillennial views.
Mm.
So yeah, I do think that was a portion of fulfillment in that, but then it's also has a fulfillment down the road in all of those sort of things, right? So
When
a large
Jesus,
scale.
yeah, when Jesus is describing the verse I was referring to, by the way, was just a few verses later. In verse 34, he says, "Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." So I've heard the multiple fulfillments kind of idea, and I think some of that maybe comes from like a lot of the prophecies, or a lot of the things that David did, like also apply to Christ, and a lot of the things that a lot of characters in the Bible do also apply to Christ later. And so in that way, things have multiple fulfillments. Like there are prophecies about judgment, and we can say like, well, there are multiple judgments in the future. And so when God gives some kind of prophecy to Israel that says, if you sin, I will destroy you, then we can say like, oh, well, that prophecy has multiple fulfillments because
Right.
that's all through time. But it's like, if a prophecy is so specific, I don't see any reason to believe that it would have multiple fulfillments, especially if Jesus says something like, all of these things will come to pass before this generation passes away. And he says earlier, one of the verses I read was, nothing this bad has ever happened. When he was talking about the destruction of the temple, nothing this bad has ever happened, and it never will happen again. Like that seems to me to totally invalidate the idea of a second fulfillment
That's
of
fair.
that prophecy.
Yeah, and again, I should have said this before, but like that's the Matthew 24, which I know a lot of people look to, especially premill, as end times prophecy.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not necessarily convinced either that all of or most of Matthew 24 really is the end times prophecy either. I think it might have been
Nice.
referred. No, I agree with you. I do head towards like more of the Thessalonians, the Revelation stuff in there,
Yep.
but I do see that I've listened to again. Credit where credit's due. It was Calvary Chapel teaching through one of their online apps. It was talking about, yeah, this may not really have been about the end times.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's good. And I think it's honest to read, even for me, not everything makes sense under my view. And that's not necessarily because it's incorrect, because somebody's correct. Either Jesus is coming
Sure.
back before the millennium or after. Like one of them has to be true, unless you're an amillennialist, and then like whatever they say. Like,
Whatever they
well, amillennialism means there's no millennium, but there is a millennium. But amillennialists don't actually believe that there's no millennium. But it's like, anyway, forget that.
we can toss. I don't know. I'm not a fan of the amillennial or the definitely, and I think it's probably heretical, the entirely preterist viewpoint as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. To believe that everything in Revelation happened in the past so that's not what I believe at all. I'm a partial preterist.
Yeah.
And so are you, to believe that some of the prophecies in Revelation have already come to pass. And so like everybody should be a partial preterist, but to believe that everything happened in the past means like you believe Jesus already returned, which is, yeah, that would be considered heresy. But it's interesting because it's hard to make sense of absolutely everything in the Bible. And so my goal is to pick the position with the least number of problems. There are going to be difficulties for me. There's going to be difficulties for every position, but the goal should be to pick the position with the least number of problems. And so, I mean, if you're reading a passage or like, what your church teaches, and to say like, this might this is like, I don't really know what to do with this. I think that's good. Like, that's being honest. Now we should try to figure out what to do with those things. But I think that's a lot more honest than like, no, all this happened. I don't care what you think, or like,
Yeah.
it
Well, like I
had to
said,
happen because I look at the world and it's worse today than it was 10 years ago. And that's the foundation of their whole argument.
yeah.
And it
And
is.
so,
And like, that's true. The world
yeah,
is worse than it was 10 years, or at least America, right? America is worse than it was 10 years ago. But I'm trying to see the big picture. Is the
yeah.
world better than it was 2000 years ago? Absolutely, it was.
Yeah, it's that argument that a number of making is it's like we're going through another dark ages right now, as far as information and the way things are going with the world. But that doesn't mean that in the post millennial, obviously, that this is like a dark portion on an upward trend. It's like
Yeah,
I get
exactly.
that.
Like on a graph, we're in a valley. Like, I fully
Yeah,
recognize that things are worse than they were for, like, America is morally worse than it was for my parents or my grandparents. But is it morally worse than it was in the 1600s when Native American tribes were cannibalizing each other? No,
right.
it's far better. And
Yeah,
some people, like, without actually giving me evidence in my comments section, they're like, no, the world is like, Christians are far more persecuted now than ever. And I would
and
say, like, well,
how we
there
could
are,
possibly do that.
right. Nice. So we agree on
Yeah,
that too. It's like there are more people in the world. And so maybe you could argue like there's a bigger number of Christians being persecuted. However, like, one of the things I say is in the Roman Empire, the biggest and most civilized empire on the planet was killing Christians en masse, as many as they could find, and sticking their heads on pikes lining the road. The only countries that are killing Christians, a lot of them are uncivilized countries led by Islam, right?
yeah,
No,
yeah,
no major civilized country is murdering Christians en masse. There might be
yeah.
some Christians being killed for their faith in some civilized countries, yes, but like, is it the whole country's position? Like, Christians need to die? No, not at all. Far from it. We are far better in the world as we were back then. And what I'm doing is just extrapolating that out for another few hundred or few thousand years and saying, like, well,
Sure.
if we've come this far in 2000 years, then it really does seem feasible that, like it says in Ephesians, the church will fill him who fills all in all, or the leaven will leaven the whole lump of bread, and that, the whole world will come to know Christ.
And see, that's where I get, again, part of like maybe I'm just picking things off the shelf that I think work best for me, and not jumping into wholeheartedly to one viewpoint. But again, I agree with you. I think the world is getting better, and then I go back to what I was talking
You're a
about.
post millennial, I think. You are like
No, but see, this is
teetering.
where I go back to that on the whole things are getting better, and you have that it's that technocracy, the piece there that where things are getting easier to control.
Yeah.
And I think that's the piece where I can still go towards the premillennial view, because while I think things are getting better for people, technology is getting keeping people healthier, lives are getting better, um, but there's still that it's also that double-edged sword. While things are getting better because of it, it also
Yeah.
is creating that ability for what most premillennials would say is that end time power control, all that sort of stuff, by a
So
select few. It doesn't have to be global
yeah.
horrible unless they like overnight. It's like now now everything's bad because they've enforced
Yeah,
everything. You
that's
know
what
what
I
I
was going to ask. So do you see, like, it's funny that we agree on this, because like I've literally never met any other premillennial that's like, no, yeah, obviously the world's getting better. But do you see the world like getting better and better and better until a certain point the bad guys just are unleashed, and then, everything terrible happens, and then, all the Christians are wiped out or raptured, and then Jesus comes back? That
Yeah, I
that
don't know.
seems narratively strange to me, but
Yeah,
you tell me.
I don't know that it would be. Uh, Again, I don't think it would be like a just like a boom, here it goes. It's like
No.
anything in life. It's a that boiling point piece, right? Or that not boiling point, but like it's just while things are getting, they're both coming like this, right?
Yeah.
The world's getting better, and the power and ability for, and maybe this is completely incoherent to the theology or just the eschatology, but I see that
I
again,
think I see what you're saying, but at some point the bad has to conquer the good. And so what you're saying is like
or
the,
it gets
you
to the
know,
point, or it gets right there, and that's when the rapture happens. When they're, you know what I mean? I don't know. I'm
I
speculating.
I
I'm in
kind
my
of see
I'm
what you're
in my wheelhouse
saying.
a little bit.
Yeah, so you're saying the world can be like, yeah, that's interesting. I don't see how that would be possible, just
Really?
because like here in America, things are bad, but there's also a lot of good, happening to whatever. At some point, like I think in terms of maybe net good, the world is more net good now than it was 2000 years ago. And there is a greater amount of evil, but like as evil increases, like good increases even more, is the way I see things. And because like, Christianity has spread to most of the nations in the world, and a lot of people have apostatized, but even more have come to Christ, and Christianity spreading, and like almost nobody has never heard of Jesus in the world anymore. It's
Yeah.
amazing. And a lot of people are going to be like, no, there's tons of people who don't know Jesus. I know. But relatively speaking, you know uh, people in nearly every nation in the world, some people in every nation have heard of Jesus, and it's
Yeah.
incredible. But to me, that would have to take some kind of reverse direction at some point for things to become so bad. Like, a part of a really important part of my faith is to, or my what I talk about on my podcast, as you know, is Christians have to live faithfully. And so I think as the world becomes more and more Christian, which it is, the world will become a morally better and better place, and it will become more and more resistant to evil. And so I think if there is good in the world, then it automatically is resistant against that evil. And if like those big evil guys come to take over the world, in my view, they're going to lose. Like,
Mm.
but in your view, you would have to say, no, they win. The Christians lose, which kind of takes us back to the point that like the church has to lose in the end
Yeah.
in premillennialism.
Yeah, fair enough. If that's the way, I do kind of see that. It's a very, yeah, you're right. It's a negative, it's a cynical viewpoint on how things go. I mean, you look at historical examples, and again, I know they aren't an analog exactly, but I mean, the evil people, s- like, I mean, let's take the obvious, the Hitler example, right?
Yeah.
Where he takes a country that there's tons of different pieces and political pieces and historical economic pieces there, but it all comes together, and you have a Hitler come up, and he is able to direct the entire nation against the world essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that look like at scale today, right?
Yeah.
That's where I kind of go with that thought process.
Interesting. Yeah, and to me, it seems like, and ultimately, all of this is speculation because it's like what's going to happen in the future. In my
Yeah,
view, it's entirely possible that America and let's say like half the nations in the world are destroyed by nuclear war, and then things get better over the next 2,000 years. You know what I mean? So
that's
like
true. Yeah,
that 100% fits into my view. As long as the world gets better and better, and the gospel fills the earth, and then knowing that Jesus is reigning now, and he
yeah,
will come back once his enemies are made his footstool, like it says in Psalm 2, I believe. Then bad stuff can happen. Like we I think we can lose battles. Like the church certainly can lose battles. I'm 100% comfortable saying that, but I don't want to say that the church loses the war.
hmm,
Like the and I think in the premillennial position, you have to say the church can win battles, the church can win or lose battles, but the church has to lose the war, and then Jesus comes in and defeats the enemies, not the church, but Jesus. But I see the
yeah,
church as the body of Christ. It's the mechanism that God uses to defeat his enemies on earth. His enemies are laid under his feet
yeah,
by the church, and not by force either, because a lot of other people are like, oh, God doesn't force people to believe. And I'm like, where did that come from?
yeah.
It's
I
like,
see
no,
that.
by the spreading of the gospel, this happens.
Yeah, that fallacy. Like, there's a few things. Like, I know that's one way when we talk about, because circling back, it was all talking about Christian nationalism, I think is where that came in. And
Oh
that
yeah.
sort of, that's where the conversation started in all of this,
Yeah.
back in your previous podcasts. And yeah, there's like, well, of course it's a Christian nation. We're not, doesn't mean that we're forcing people. It's not like an Islamic type of thing where, you know, everything's by Sharia law and you're forced. It's
Yeah.
like Christianity is the basis of freedom. Like that's what the US was founded on. And that allowed for anything really, within reasons. I mean, the founders had much better values than we give them credit for a lot of times in today's, they would have seen the secular culture that we live in now, and it'll have them rolling in their graves.
That's for
But
sure.
personal takeaway from eschatology, looking at all of this, is one, you know, I still hold the premillennial viewpoint, and like I said, I'm open to the postmillennial. I'm that panmillennial. Whatever happens, happens, and God's got it in control, and I don't. But I have to come back to how does that affect me? Because I see thing I see with the postmillennial, the problem with the postmillennials, or potentially, and I'm not saying it's everyone, but
Sure.
it's that, well, we've got forever. So it's kind of a lackadaisical attitude, and it doesn't happen. Again, I'm not saying that most people are like this, but I'm saying that's
Yeah. That would be
the
the
one,
natural temptation. Yeah, sure.
the one ditch, right? Especially with the reformed portion of that, saying that, you know, God determines off the bat who's elected and who isn't. So really, you can take your hands off the wheel and just let everything go wherever it goes, right? And then you end up in that ditch, right? So that's one side where I definitely see the premillennial side, and I see this in a lot of people that I know, where they're so focused on the return of Christ that they lose a lot of the future planning, the
Yeah.
thought of down the road, right? They're like,
Right.
oh, he's going to come back anytime now. It'll be right away. And there's not that postmillennial, the proper postmillennial view of planning out for the future and looking at future things. And so what I've always said is that, or I shouldn't say always, what I'm looking at is I want to live my life with the urgency of a premillennial
Yeah.
and the planning of a postmillennial.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think, however, just to push that a little bit, I think that is only possible if postmillennialism is true. Because if you are planning out for, you know, like your great grandkids, it would actually be unwise of you to do that if Jesus is going to come back tomorrow, right? Our lives are lived very differently. We make different investments. We make different choices if we think, and a lot of people do, like Jesus could come back any day now. A ton of people believe that. And I think, man, that's totally unwise because, you know, if he doesn't, you know, there are all those scams that people get bought into where it's like, you know, I'll pay me to take care of your dog once you're raptured, that kind of thing. And like, we only hire atheists, you know, or whatever happened, like 20, whatever year it was. But like people buy into that stuff.
Yeah.
And it, if you, like, if you're a premillennial and you think, now some premillennials believe like, oh no, it's still going to be a few hundred years because we're not that bad yet. And so, and I think that's far more reasonable, but to me, we should be planning hundreds, or, you know, we should be planning with our great grandchildren in mind. And it seems to me under premillennialism, that would be unwise to do automatically because Jesus could come back potentially any day. But under postmillennialism, we still have to share the gospel to the world. And to me, I still very much have that urgency to share the gospel because the more I share the gospel, the faster Jesus is going to come back, because I know once the world comes to Christ, Jesus is going to come back. And certainly that's missed in a lot of, I mean, I don't know, the postmillennials that I'm familiar with are very dedicated to sharing the gospel, but I can see, like, let's say millennials, I think all millennials make up probably the most of evangelical Christianity in America, and they're not good evangelists, but I think the postmillennials are very good evangelists.
I don't disagree with you. I mean, I look at some of the people that I do follow, like Doug Wilson,
Oh yeah,
James White. And then, again, I don't agree with everything they have to say, but I really love the wisdom that they have for sure. Oh, and these are faithful guys that, of course, I mean, their evangelism is off the charts. There's so but yeah, I mean, I don't know that I agree with. I mean, because I don't know the hour of the day. He could be tomorrow. He could be 200 years from now. He could be 2,000 years from now. Uh, I think as a premillennial, a prudent viewpoint is to live with that future planning in mind. But I understand where people have that failure and they think, oh, he's coming right away. We should, and that's where I go back to again the Christian nationalism thing and whatnot. And the discussions that I've had with other premillennials, they're like, well, don't worry about that. Our focus is time is short. We just need to focus on saving as many as we can. That sort of thing. And I say, yeah, that's great. We should be focused on saving anything we can. And I'm not saying that you personally need to get into politics. I say, but if somebody has that bent in that direction, why shouldn't we get behind them? I mean, technically, we're all in politics. Anything we do every day, that's part of being political, is talking with people is political. But we should seek for righteousness in the land. Like, even if I didn't think that it's going to work, right?
Yeah, that's good.
Why wouldn't I want to be found when Christ returns doing what was right, going after righteousness, chasing after that? Even if ultimately I thought that I was going to be defeated, if that's where we're going to put it. As a Christian, I should still be chasing after righteousness for myself, for my family, for my community, for my country. And that means being active in the political sphere as well. And if I can put somebody into politics or into place that has a Christian viewpoint, and I can put more people that way and more, like, sure, I would love to see, well, your country, I mean, I'm in Canada, but I'd love to see your country turn, and somehow, I don't know how it would happen, but see Canada turn back to Christ. I mean, we were founded on Christian principles too, right? It's all in our beginning. It's all over our parliament buildings. There's scripture written everywhere. From sea to sea was part of our foundation, and that comes, I think it's in Psalms. It talks about his dominion from sea to sea. That's why we were founded as the Dominion of Canada, because it references that verse. The Canadian flag, the Canadian flag with the two red bars, it was initially supposed to be two blue bars, indicating from sea to sea. He has dominion from sea to sea. So
that's
both
cool.
countries have that backbone that we run away from. And I think, like I said, as a Christian, I mean, people work as Christians in places where everything's against them all the time. And they, let's say China, for example, right? The government is against them. Do people just be like, do they give up? And no, you fight the fight, whether you think you're going to win it or not, because that's what Christ would have us do.
Yeah, man, that's good stuff. We definitely agree on more than we disagree on. And it sounds like
I think that's the case for most people. It's just we get so nitpicky in the differences. I've always hated church politics because of that. Like, well, we believe this and we believe this, so we got to separate. It's like, why can't we
no reason to divide over that stuff? Yeah, for sure. But it does sound like you agree with a lot more postmillennials than I know than a lot of premillennials. So that's interesting.
Yeah. Oh, it's because I've done like I said, I came to realize and understand that many of my friends and people that I value are also postmillennials. And I wanted to, instead of being like, well, you're wrong, I'd be like, well, why do you believe that?
Right.
How do you come to understand that? And then I can take portions of that I think are right. And I can incorporate that. Even if I'm not necessarily on that page, I can still go, yeah, that sounds right anyways.
That's the way we all ought to be, being willing to listen to other people's arguments and not divide over secondary issues if we're all just trying to be faithful Christians. So that's awesome. I'm glad we got to talk today, and I'm glad we discovered that we agree on even theologically a lot more than I thought we would. In terms of, I mean, even just in the premillennial, postmillennial discussion, we agree on a lot more than I thought we would. So that was a fun surprise. And then hopefully the listeners will find this interesting too, and maybe some of the less reasonable premillennialists will be bought over, at least to your side, if not to my side. So that's fun. Thanks for coming on. Maybe we can next time talk about Christian nationalism or Reformed theology. That was the other thing we could talk about,
Yes.
Reformed theology, and maybe I didn't have a live conversion to postmillennialism like I was hoping, but maybe I can make some progress somewhere else.
I think I'm still in the same place where I lean one way, but I'm
Sure.
open to everything, and God will do what He does, and I just trust that my God is got everything under control. My God is sovereign. So
Yeah. Amen. Tell us where people can find you.
you can find me at Instagram. It's at Spirit of Fear Clothing, and then you can go to my website too if you're interested in the brand, spiritoffear.com.